Good morning and welcome. I'm Arthur Demrich. I'm the director of the Consortium for Science Policy and Outcomes. Delighted to welcome you this morning. A couple logistics points when we start. So bathrooms are over here to my right, your left. And in the unlikely event of an emergency, there are two staircases that go down. One is out here immediately, and then the other is diagonal across. So just so you know. So I'm pleased to welcome you today to today's program. It's the first in a series that we've branded as Rethinking Science, Policy. So if you aren't familiar with our work, the Consortium for Science Policy and Outcomes conducts policy-relevant social science research that's oriented to developing methods and tools that can be applied and used by federal agencies, as well as state and other science policy entities. We also teach courses in science and technology policy, and we organize and host presentations and discussions on a variety of issues in science, technology, and biomedical research policy. We're a convener of science policy implementers. These are the unsung people who manage programs that make a difference in people's lives. Since 2012, the New Tools for Science Policy series has been providing a platform for researchers, policymakers, and these policy implementers to exchange knowledge and discuss new methods. This spring, we're beginning an exploration of how to rebuild science and technology policy for the future. So that's why we've kind of rebranded it as Rethinking Science, Policy. So the topic of today's talk is technology assessment. And at one level, of course, we've been assessing and reassessing technology's impacts basically through all of human history. Humans are distinctive in their use of technology, after all. And then we've been doing it more systematically, really, since the Industrial Revolution sparked some assessments by historians and economists, among others. But the field really came into its own in the 1970s, the creation of the U.S. Office of Technology Assessment, and development of new analytics to inform policy decisions and anticipate where a given technology area was headed. And this kind of anticipation and foresight work, not just in terms of economic projections, how many people will have telephones in their homes in 20 years kind of thing, but really also thinking through, like, how will society change as new technologies come into widespread use? So our featured speaker today is John Alec. He's likely well known to most of you. He's a longtime analyst of technological change and its ramifications. He's taught at several universities and left a tenured position in the late 1970s to join the OTA, where he worked until 1995. Since that time, he's continued to research and publish on technology assessment, including numerous books and dozens of influential articles. As the flyer hinted, there's a diverse mix of think tanks, companies, trade associations, and university researchers engaged in one form or another of technology assessment. But separating signal from noise has never been more difficult. As famously W.B. Yeats suggested, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. John, how do we avoid anarchy being loosed upon the world?
Fight the power. To me, technology is different from science, and I'm going to talk primarily about technology. OTA did not do very much science policy. We tried to look much more broadly than just science. And to me, technology assessment really needs to address policymakers, the people who have the power, make the decisions in the federal government. It's different at the state level, it's different in other countries, but in the US, it's the executive branch and Congress. Now, what's happened since OTA closed down is there's been more noise. OTA is gone. The legislation is still there. There is still talk about trying to revitalize it, bring it back. I don't think you can. I think those days are gone. I think OTA is dead and buried, and we should stab a stake in its heart and think differently. Okay, I'm going the wrong way. Here's my quotation. Anybody who's reached the 8th grade knows you can't go wrong quoting George Orwell. So I'll let you read that. He was talking mostly about the Nazis in Germany. This is in the middle of World War II, and to some extent about the communists in the Soviet Union, and to some extent also about his own government, which was full of noise, much of it from Winston Churchill. But something else that he said, let me just quote that. This quotation is from a review he did, a very short review of pamphlets. This is, now we have, of course, the web. You don't have many pamphlets anymore. But pamphleteering was a big deal back then. And Orwell in his diary said, pamphleteering is either party line or astrology. And I think that's still valid today. We have a choice of which we listen to. Now, technology itself is messy. That's the point of this. I think you have to get inside of technical systems and dig much more deeply than the pontificators that are flourishing in Washington that bombard us with noise. They talk about technology as if they understand it. Very few of them do, whether they're talking about artificial intelligence or, hypersonic weapons or how businesses, in fact, incorporate technology in their operations. Now, I want to try and illustrate how I think technology in the system, technology assessment in the future ought to work. I think that you have to zero in on things that really make a difference before you start talking about them. And I have tried to do that in three big questions that I think are kind of at the top of my agenda, at least, for how technology is going to affect us in the coming decades. The first is probably the most difficult to deal with. It's the relationship between technological change and inequality. And of course, there's all kinds of inequality. There's inequality in income, in wealth, and social status, so on and so forth. I'm going to talk primarily about income inequality. And here I think, you have to get away from all the arm waving that the economists do about, models and how technology fits into the models, because they don't have good measures of either technical change or of labor skills to build into those models. So I think what we mostly hear about technology and inequality is a lot of noise. I think what we ought to do is look at, first of all, the basic data, which shows a sharp break in the 1970s in the proportion of income, this is for the US, that goes to labor and capital. And what we see here is that capital is doing fine and labor is doing very poorly. Now, this is historically no surprise. Arthur mentioned the Industrial Revolution. The people who study early impacts of technological change on social equality and inequality go all the way back to the transition from hunters and gatherers to agriculture, and argue, I think, pretty persuasively that once settled agriculture became kind of, the standard pattern, it gave a basis for the wealthier to accumulate land, draft animals, food, and so on at a faster rate than others. And then the, rough equality that we believe was characteristic of hunters and gatherers in prehistory began to disappear slowly over centuries. That sort of thing is still going on. And the rich are getting richer. Why? I think that the starting point in explaining why is the declining power of organized labor. There is only one set of social forces potentially coherent enough, big enough to offset corporate power and the power of the wealthy, which has increasingly dominated the United States since the close of World War II. And here you see the decline, really a steep, steady decline in union coverage in the US economy.
What are the year?
Absent.
What's the year axis? Can't read the year.
Oh, okay. It goes from, hold on, let me look at my slide. It goes from 1950 to roughly 2020. Sorry, that got cut off the bottom.
The fall off is just about when the curves diverge.
The fall off starts in 1950.
I mean, the previous chart, the curve started diverging in the 70s, and the steep drop of the red curve, anyway, that's about 1970.
Yeah, the data for labor coverage is very poor through 1968. That's one of the reasons why there's red and black on there. This chart I took from a publication by Hank Faber, who is one of the best known labor economists in the US. And nothing this careful has ever appeared before. This is from a paper in JP, Journal of Political Economy, from a couple of years ago. What happened really is that after World War II, the Taft-Hartley Act was passed over President Truman's veto in 1946, which clawed back many of the gains that labor had made in terms of their ability to offset the organized opposition of employers during the Roosevelt administration in the 1930s. And since then, employers have basically continued to beat back labor unions, and they're, of course, still doing it, as we all know. I could go on about that, but I won't. The point of these two slides is to say, if you want to look at where technology comes into all this, you have to look at how technology affects the ability of workers individually and collectively to bargain with employers. All the kind of macro stuff that economists, and I'm excluding people like Faber from this, that economists like to talk about really washes that all away. And I think that's wrong. Whoop, going the wrong way again. Okay, I'm going to go very quickly through these. Climate change is, of course, full of noise. We have hundreds of climate models, scientists fussing about changes at the margins, people objecting to assumptions in the models and so on. Again, I think that's kind of misleading. I think the starting point here has to be the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which puts out its assessment reports on a worldwide basis. They're very influential. I think what we don't understand is how political that process has been from the very beginning. The US, in fact, helped put the IPCC together because there was dissensus within the US government on how to respond to climate change going back to the 1970s. You had basically the EPA on one side saying, this is a big deal, we got to do something. That's in the late 70s. And you had the Energy Department still pushing things like fossil fuels. When the Reagan administration came in 1980, they helped facilitate the startup of the IPCC, in part to take the heat off of the US government itself. They say, wait, let's see what the scientists have to say. Now we know what they have to say, and we're withdrawing from the IPCC. But that's neither here nor there. What has the politicization done? It's left us with, I think, a really unfortunate fallback, a political compromise that has taken the form of saying we may very well overshoot the Paris targets by a lot, but we will claw back carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and after some decades we'll catch up. I don't think that's going to happen. I think it's just a kludge, and I will show you on the next slide why. This is a fossil fuel power plant with carbon capture and storage added to it. The part in the red box is the CCS. This is an artist's rendering because nothing like this has yet been built, even though we've been talking about it for at least 30 years. And I don't think it ever will be built because it's a parasitic drag on energy production. It produces more carbon dioxide itself since you have to use quite a lot of electrical power to run this stuff. Technologically, it's pretty straightforward. You take the flue gases from the power plant, you scrub the carbon dioxide from them, then you strip the carbon dioxide away, you inject it underground. Chemical engineers and chemical companies know how to do that. But it's not, in my view, a very practical way to extract carbon dioxide from power plant emissions, simply because the costs will rise. You lose efficiency if that power plant over on the left is, let's say, 35 to 40% efficient without carbon dioxide capture and storage. If you start stripping the stuff out, it takes enough power to drive the system that your overall efficiency drops to maybe 25 to 30%. And it drives up electricity costs by roughly 50%, which not only residential customers will scream at, so will the people building, data storage farms, which are driving up electricity consumption right now. They will effectively lobby against any of this, I think. So now, a couple slides ago, there was a quotation from The Economist saying, no CCS has ever been built at scale. That's true. Those that have been built mostly are attached to oil and gas wells. They have been used for enhanced oil recovery. You pump the carbon dioxide back underground, it forces more fossil fuels out. Again, oil companies know how to do that. They do that. This is probably the best known example of carbon dioxide capture and storage in the world. This is in Norway. This is not used for enhanced oil recovery. Here, the carbon dioxide is rammed back into the seabed. The point of there's 2 points really to this slide. First, this is small in scale. Norway is not a big country, but even if Equinor lived up to their promises, this would be something like 2% of Norway's greenhouse gas emissions. Moreover, they have not been living up to what they said they were going to do. They've had all kinds of problems, and this shows the gap between their promises and the actuality over the last half dozen years or so. So this has been held out as a flagship for decades now to show we can do this. This has been in operation since 1998. They've had trouble with the geological storage. Geological storage is much messier than it's been portrayed as. So the end point of this is not going to work. You have to find another way to deal with climate change. Okay, militarization. DOD and nuclear weapons, which are in the Energy Department, the National Nuclear Security Administration, have become kind of a sacred cow. We aren't going to cut those. We haven't been cutting those for years. Put everything together that goes to national security these days, you get well over $1 trillion a year. DOD's budget is like $830 billion right now. But people, when they quote that number and say, look, it's not really that big. First of all, it is that big, but they leave a lot of stuff out. They leave out, health, homeland security. They leave out much of the Coast Guard. They leave out some of the intelligence agencies, and they leave out DOD and nuclear weapons. And if you add all those in, you get these probably this year, maybe 1.3 trillion. Now, there's a lot of waste, fraud, and abuse in DOD. We aren't talking about that today. We're looking other places for waste, fraud, and abuse. Actually, there is not too much fraud anywhere, and not in weapons programs either. But there are about 80 major weapons programs underway at any one time. There is variable amounts of waste in all of those. This is well known. Dodaro, as you probably know, has been the head of GAO for quite a few years now. This is his testimony from a month ago in reporting on their latest big risk programs, of which DOD is quite prominent. GAO has been tracking major weapons programs for 55 years now, and their conclusions really have not changed very much. Programs are over budget, they're over schedule, and they don't deliver the bang for the buck that was promised. Some of that is due to waste, very little is due to fraud. But there is a lot of abuse, and it's mostly in the private sector. It's not in government. We have all kinds of rules and regulations that are there to control, to avoid fraud. They're pretty effective at that. What they do is create all kinds of opportunities for private firms to game the system. And they do that. They know how to do that because they've been doing it for decades now. That's a target. And specifically, I think if you you can't look at 80 weapons programs in any kind of realistic technology assessment. You have to pick one. And I think what you should look at is nuclear modernization. Nobody wants to fight a nuclear war. Nobody can fight a nuclear war. It would probably, be a total catastrophe because nobody knows how to do it. There is no experience base. Militaries plan and fight based on their experience. The Russians don't know how to fight a nuclear war. Experts who can read Russian can explain that all in ways that I cannot. But they don't know, they're saber rattling. That's what Putin has been doing. I think the essential point is that even if a small nuclear weapon were set off someplace, say Putin decided to blast a site in Ukraine, nobody knows what would happen next. There is a substantial probability that uncontrolled escalation would follow. There is just no basis for predicting that. It's a total unknown. So the question is, how many nuclear weapons does it take to maintain deterrence? And, armchair strategists have argued about that for 75 years now. There is no way to know, it seems to me. But I think that there are far too many of those already, and that the modernization that DOD and DOD have planned, which is likely to cost a lot of money, is a place to do a real technology assessment. This is CBO, the Congressional Budget Office. These are their projections. These add up to a little less because they only go 30 years ahead. That's a congressional directive. They don't have any choice with that. Modernization basically refers to delivery vehicles, so-called, bombers, tactical fighters for tactical nukes, ballistic missiles, submarines, so on and so forth. Operations and sustainment is keeping all those aircraft flying. NC3 is nuclear command control communications, which includes early warning. And then down at the bottom, you have the weapons laboratories, which are run by contractors for the Energy Department. So this is the last slide. I think if you want to do real technology assessments on any of these, you have to get inside the technical systems, understand them. And I think the way you do that is get out into the field and talk to people. If you want to understand nuclear weapons, go to the weapons labs, talk to the scientists on an unclassified basis, hear what they have to say, spend enough time to do it so you can separate the wheat from the chaff, who's BSing you, who's not. Talk to the military people who are in operations, who worry about how C3I, command control, communications, and intelligence works, who know how robust the systems are, and again, separate the wheat from the chaff. You have to understand the technology to do TA, and it's not science, it's technical systems. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. So I should have said this at the outset, but our plan for this, as with our other workshops, is to have a 30-minute provocative talk, have around 30 minutes of Q&A and discussion in the room, and then some additional, 20, 30 minutes to just informally network. There's plenty of coffee and more food, so if you're hungry at all, grab something. And we are now open to questions. I'll come around with the mic. And again, the mic is because we're recording it so that audio gets on the record. And Jerry. And please introduce yourself when you...
Hi, Jerry Epstein, former OTA, currently an adjunct at Rand Corporation. John, fascinating. I really love you cutting down to these three important issues. But I'm going to raise one that isn't directly raised here, but I heard a lot in the OTA and post-OTA world, which is participatory technology assessment and involving stakeholders that OTA we really didn't necessarily overtly do. We might put a public interest group on an advisory panel, but people, particularly at ASU, have taken a large role in saying that's not the way one gathers public input in some systematic way. How does that change, or how is that accommodated in the three areas you talked about? Or is it that important?
I'm a supporter of participatory technology assessment, but I worry that it doesn't get to decision makers in government. That's the gap that I see there.
Does he need a mic to the recording here or something?
Yeah, I've got a mic. Yeah. So I don't know what to do about that. I don't know enough about how participatory technology assessment works, but I also have a sense that they can't deal with at least some of the really big issues yet. Maybe in the future they will.
The first two or three categories, it seems like it might be relevant. Maybe with the role in nuclear weapons complex, not so needed, but
yeah, I think you can get partway into it, yeah. But I don't know how you get the message across to decision makers. I don't know how you influence legislators. I don't know how you influence the executive branch, cabinet officers, working level policy people in the agencies. That's where the action is.
Just on this point. Just speak into it for the recording.
So, I was reading this lecture by Harvey Brooks in 1975, and he was trying to address the question of public participation because it came up back then. And he kind of then drew a contrast between the environmental movement and the technology assessment movement. And he was saying that these movements kind of group in parallel, but one was to stop things, meaning stopping the harm. Technology assessment, on the other hand, had a little bit of optimistic view that, minimize harm, but also maximize benefit. So recently we had this book out, I forget his name, so why nothing works, and makes the same argument that Harvey Brooks was making, that it's become very hard to build stuff. And when we look at the participatory technology assessment, that's actually grew out in Europe. And what DBT, the Danish Board of Technology, way they got around this problem of actually privileging organized interests against something, right? They use deliberative processes. So they said, no, yes, you represent interests, but does it actually represent the public? So the challenge in PTA was always been, are you representing the public and who the public is? It's always privileges the organized interest. And is there a way, to get beyond that, where you can actually have genuine public input and constructive discussion? Because I think building stuff should be a shared goal.
I think you're the only one people who do PTA have to answer that question. I cannot answer that question, Mahmood.
So, just a quick observation, then there's a number of hands up. But what we have seen in recent years, and especially under the most recent administration, was a concerted effort to bring this method into federal agencies and have it begin to influence and shape large tech projects. And just, so to John's point, that historically was quite a challenge, and we've now found methods to actually do that in ways that were going quite well. But let me get to other hands in the room. Lori's been patient. Yes.
Thank you. Lori Geller, I'm with the Natural Resources Defense Council. I'll try to talk loud. Okay, great. Thanks. Yeah, I was just intrigued by one of your opening statements that an important element of technology assessment is looking at how it affects the ability of workers to collectively organize and bargain. And so what immediately came to mind was artificial intelligence, which, the huge gorilla in the room these days. And the obvious concern a lot of people have is that it will replace workers' jobs. So that gives employers a certain power over workers. So beyond that obvious concern, I'm just wondering if you have any other more nuanced thoughts about how AI will affect this balance of power with workers and organizing.
I think, the first thing I think to say is that AI has been grossly overhyped, but that's characteristic of new technologies. Additive manufacturing has been overhyped, and now, we have a more realistic view of what additive manufacturing can accomplish. I don't think anybody knows how AI will affect work in the future. The chart I showed with the divergence in the labor share, in fact, came from a report on what was the title? Towards an AI economy that works for all, that I wrote with another former OTA colleague, Stephen Herzenberg. And what we concluded there is that if you want to have an economy, an AI economy that in fact does work for all, you have to rebuild labor power and input the insights of workers based on their hands-on experience or their, head experience into your systems. Now, to some extent, GPTs try to do that, but they can get only so far because, they're scrubbing information and putting it into large language models and so on. A lot of what is tacit, implicit, escapes that process and probably will do so indefinitely, maybe not forever, but for decades into the future. So far, AI has not had very much impact on the labor market. There's something like 4 or 5% of US employers say they're actively using it. And mostly, I think they're using it in fairly small scale ways. For example, providing on-screen assistance to people who man helplines or answer questions, customer questions online. And that's useful. And it complements the worker's skills, but it's not, it's not earth-shaking. So I'd say, the key is to, if you want to really understand that, you have to go out in the workplace and you have to look at how that's been implemented. And I have to admit, I haven't done that. Steve and I haven't done that. It's costly, it takes time. We've done that in the past with other information technology systems. For example, looking at how information technology is used in hospitals and clinics. And that's actually kind of dispiriting because, the implementation has been poor. And part of the reason, just to wrap this up without taking too much time, is that hospitals are run by administrators who don't understand technology and they don't understand medical practice either. And now, of course, we have hospitals been taken over by financial equity, and they are driving down care and pushing up the bills to make money. The nurses are pretty heavily unionized, in fact. And that's one of the ways in which the hospital workforce has pushed back on some of these efforts, including the sloppy use of AI and information technology more generally. We need more of that. That's the point.
Hi, I'm Ruthanna Gordon. I'm at the University of Maryland, Arliss. I work in two fields that are adjacent to technology assessment, one of which is independent test and evaluation, which tends towards the very quantitative metrics usually defined by funders and customers rather than any sort of whole of society consideration, and the other of which is foresight, which tends to be sort of collective qualitative imagining of future scenarios that might come from where we are now. And as I look at this discussion of technology assessment, I see listen and learn, and the question that comes to me then is, and then what to get from what you've listened to a really good assessment? How do we, if we're rethinking how to do this, how do we go from going out in the field to bringing together all of these different available methods that we have, from very qualitative human imagination and values to very quantitative, are we actually achieving goals for these big problems where the metrics, if you can call it that really matter, are ultimately things like, have we managed to avoid the collapse of civilization, and is the planet still inhabitable?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I have to go back to the point that I made a couple of times, which is you have to get inside the technology and understand it. That's the way people like we have here in this room can differentiate themselves from the talking heads and the think tanks that go on and on and on and wave their arms about these things. They do not, by and large, understand technology. I've done a lot of work over the years on military technology, and you can find some good stuff, but 95, 98% of it is just arm waving. You look at all the think tanks that write about national security, and there is very little meat in that. And to me, technology assessment means understanding the technology well enough to drive the message home, whatever the message is. And it's hard to figure it out. I do not believe that you can do it any other way than synthesize in your head and put together defensible arguments that will stand up to all the bullshit.
Part of that is being a little more modest about what we think technology will do in the world, perhaps.
But can I just follow? Excellent presentation. I'm thought-provoking. But can I just follow up on that last question a little bit? Just asking you to connect the dots a little bit. So take nuclear modernization, your last example. Let's say that we had technology assessment. Let's say we had folks getting inside the technology, as you say. How does that get us beyond the nobody knows, or does it? Like, what's the kind of theory of change here, essentially, of what it will do?
Yeah. If I heard you right, you mentioned nuclear modernization specifically.
Yeah.
Okay, I was going to use that example. I think what you do is start with a problem that is fundamentally technical, which is plutonium pits. That's the core of nuclear weapons. A lot of the money in nuclear modernization is going into new facilities for manufacturing new plutonium pits for a new generation of weapons. Now, the question there is, do we know enough about how the old plutonium pits degrade and change over time to know for sure that they cannot be maintained and will not be reliable? And I don't know the answer to that, but I think that's an answerable question. And that's where I would start if I was doing a TA. I wouldn't start with ICBMs or the B-21 bomber. That's too messy, it's too politicized. You have all these big contractors. Plutonium pits are made by the National Nuclear Security Administration. They're contracted to government. They are manageable. They are people that will do what they're told. And you have leverage there that you don't have with the major delivery systems. That's where I would start.
My name is Sam Kay. I perceived a question that you were articulating in your presentation to be something along the lines of a good TA might do much better things than a bad TA, but is the best TA capable of overcoming the context of how it was created to begin with, the original parameters, or also everything that happens once it's handed off to decision makers. And I'm thinking in particular from my own experience about the pollution control technologies or evaluation of new chemicals, and the way in which the opening parameters maybe decades ago used to focus more on health and a precautionary principle. That didn't fly, and so now it's all just cost benefit. But an analysis yesterday in The Guardian about a bunch of pollution control technologies found that even when, with very conservative estimates, pollution control technologies by EPA's own very conservative estimates will save society $240 billion while costing $40 billion to implement the control technologies. We're still rolling it back. So what do we do about that, either within technology assessment, or how do we reach beyond the scope of what's inside of the TA to the broader context of the TA?
I'm going to go back to the early part of your question. You said hand off the TA to decision makers. I don't think that works. I think you have to find a message. You have to drive it home repeatedly, again and again and again, loud, bang the drum. That's what the so-called conservatives who now dominate our government have been doing since the 1950s. They have been driving home the message, which is in part individualism. That's one of the levers that they use to destroy organized labor, saying, it's socialistic, it's communism even. And what that means is quite simple. It means, oh, you don't like working for Amazon? Well, go to work for Starbucks, because individual employees cannot bargain with employers. It's just grossly asymmetric. It's much worse than Ukraine trying to fight off Russia. It's huge power against lone individuals. And that's why the message has to be driven home again and again and again, just like the propagandists for the so-called conservatives have been doing since Barry Goldwater.
Thank you, John. Excellent presentation. My name is Ping Zhong from Chinese Embassy, Science and Technology Office. I will relate my questions with my previous tasks. I was used to be part of the Chinese delegation to the UNFCCC negotiations. So I know in the United States you have your national climate assessment report. In China, we also have ours, national climate assessment report. During the negotiation, we can see a lot of negotiators from developing countries. They do not have their own assessment. They rely on the outcome, the results from the IPCC reports. So to me, I do see the value of the IPCC mechanism to providing to somewhat objective science-based assessment, so negotiators can use to facilitate the whole process of the decision making. So from your presentation, I can see you have kind of questions related with the political sizing of this mechanism. So if it's not the ideal one, so what in your mind would be the ideal model to facilitate decision making in such complicated issues? And also, some people was arguing to formulate similar mechanisms for AI governance. So for AI, what would you suggest in the future to facilitate the international governance of this important technology? And also, another question related to another work we are doing in China. It's developing a technology roadmap for the carbon neutrality target we have for 2060. So we're developing a roadmap for that. It's a continuous process. We plan to update in cycle in a few years, because in the future technology are full of uncertainties. So during this process, we are also very troubling with the right criteria to use. Like I can see in your presentation some of the argument is with probably some with value judgment. So we are also like kind of confused with if we want to do this assessment with this roadmap, we want it to be objective enough, and we have different layer of criteria on technical aspects and socioeconomic aspects, and also we have to come up with some of the value-based criteria. So for such type of work, what would you suggest, or if there's already good model to follow to combine criteria of these different layers? Thank you. Also, another one. So you
Now that's three already. I
yeah,
think,
yeah.
you know.
You mentioned about the Office of Technological Assessment. So as my understanding, if it's correct, I'm still kind of new to here. A lot of work has been undertaken now by the GAO. They also have a science and technology assessment branch within GAO, and also the congressional research service. So comparing what the OTA did, and also current situation, do you think they are doing a good job? If not, what's the area need to be improved? Thank you.
Okay. I don't know if I can answer all four of those, but let me start with the IPCC. IPCC's scientific assessments are very valuable and useful for especially, as you say, for countries that don't have as much internal expertise as the rich countries do. What I was referring to, and I should have probably made this clear, is the summaries for policymakers, which are edited on a line by line and word by word basis by people representing governments and private interest groups, corporations, as well as scientists. And that's how we end up with the kind of, empty promises of things like carbon capture and storage. I did not mean to criticize the scientific work. That's very, very valuable. Second, on AI, I think that does need a full-scale technology assessment before the question you asked can be answered. And certainly that hasn't been done in the US. And I don't think that the European rules really reflect that either. It's hard to do, but I think it at least if you bring enough people together and talk about it, you can go further in kind of regulating AI. And I think, you have to regulate. All societies regulate things. I think AI will have to be regulated. I'm going to skip over the question about objective enough. I don't, that's a fraught topic. Objectivity is a myth, after all. We all have prejudices, opinions. Certainly I do. You've heard some of them. But the last question is important. It's the other congressional agencies. It's GAO, CRS, and CBO as well, the Budget Office. In my view, although the Budget Office, has a narrower scope than either CRS or GAO, when they do dig into technology, they do a good job. And I think that that's not as widely recognized as it should be. I hold out hopes for GAO, but I've looked at a number of their assessments quite closely. And I don't see them going out in the field and talking to people to do the technology. I see selective citations from the published literature, which are narrow and not very well chosen. So I think they have a lot of work to do. CRS is an excellent agency. They simply are overwhelmed with topics. And I don't think we can expect them to dig very deeply into technology more than they have. What they do in an excellent way.
Dorothy Robine, another former OTA, or now a senior fellow with the ITIF Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. I'm bothered by your articulation of collective bargaining and unionization as the way to capture, to preserve benefits or achieve more benefits for to reduce income inequality. So there is a trade-off between growing the pie, how big you grow it, and how the pie is distributed. And the United States has a set of institutions and values that have favored the growth of the pie. We have not done as good a job at the redistribution. Europe has focused more on redistribution at the expense of growing the pie. I would take our model over Europe's, which has been much more regulatory in nature. But I don't see collective bargaining and unions as being the only way to pursue the welfare of individual workers. That's one way. Wage insurance is another way. I mean, there's real downsides to unions. You know, they were their own worst enemy in a lot of areas. So it seems to me that's not the only approach.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I think unions need to reinvent themselves too. The basis of the argument, I think, is this. There is no other organized force in U.S. society that has the potential capacity to counterbalance corporations and the wealthy. That's a consequence of individualism. There was a time, maybe long ago, when you might potentially argue that organized religion could be a countervailing force. That's certainly not true anymore. And I just don't see mechanisms that can bring large enough groups of people together to combat the dominance, the political dominance of corporations and the wealthy. I would welcome evidence that there is some way to bring people together other than through organized labor. I just don't see it.
But what's the evidence that that's feasible today? I mean, workers themselves don't support it. They all voted Republican.
Yeah, no, I know that. I think the labor movement needs to be reinvented.
Or John, I mean, when we think of technology assessment, and you've pointed to the importance of sort of understanding the technology, getting into both how it works and then also how the people who invented it think, and then making, in a way, what is ultimately a sort of qualitative assessment of what will the impacts be. So there are technologies that basically liberate us, that enable individuals to either become wealthy or express themselves. There are technologies that ultimately serve to repress us, that control us, that are technologies of control. Can you look at a technology and know what it will be? How do we? That's kind of the tension here, right? We still struggle to do that.
I think we'll always struggle to do that. I think, to me, you always have to start by recognizing that every technology is different, and you need to understand the details. I mean, we generalize about manufacturing all the time. It's in the newspapers every day, the decline of U.S. manufacturing. Well, what does that mean? Petrochemicals? Pharmaceuticals? Well, auto plants are nothing like those manufacturing industries. Does it mean food processing? Food processing is a manufacturing industry too. These generalizations they're part of the noise. I think you have to get granular with each of these technologies to figure out whether it's beneficial or whether it's potentially harmful.
All right, we'll take one more.
Thank you for the presentation. To kind of some of the questions that have been asked, about what next after you do a TA. What do you see as the mechanisms or levers we have to pull if we do decide that a technology is not liberative or it is repressive? Like what political tools, what policy tools do we have to close off a technology or to remove a technology from our society if we do deem that it is not good for us or not in the public interest?
I think you have to get the message across to policymakers that, scientists in particular have always been very careful not to offend policymakers in the US because they get research funds, of course, from government. There's been kind of a social contract, which is since World War II, government will support research, most of which is in universities, and the scientists will give advice when asked, and they will respond politely, and they will not make big waves. They might make wavelets. That's actually a scientific term, but they aren't going to make big waves. And so that's a hurdle to be overcome. Technologists in general include, of course, engineers and technicians and so on and so forth, computer experts. Most of those people work for private firms and they do what they're told. They aren't gonna make a lot of noise. So I don't know who drives the message home, but I think that's something that has to be figured out if technology assessment is going to be, revitalized, reinvented, rebuilt, whatever. You have to find a way to get the message out. The old OTA had too narrow a constituency, and there is far less demand for technology assessment today than there was 30, 40 years ago. Nobody in government, I shouldn't say nobody, few people in government want honest technology assessment. The agencies have their agendas. They have policy shops. They push out the message of their department, their sub-agency, whatever. And, Congress, as we all know, at the moment is dysfunctional.
All right, on that happy note,
I didn't mean to end
let
that
me
way.
thank you all for coming. Please join me in thanking John Allen. We encourage you to stick around, have some additional coffee and pastries, and please join us. This is a series this spring, so we have future talks on Rethinking NIH. My colleague Bhavin Sampad in the room. We will be looking at regulation in the area of sports technology, and more recently, or coming up Monday, March 31st, Christy Spackman and Sushira Pochuraji will be talking on rethinking taste and odor in drinking water. So we tend to think of drinking water as tasteless, but of course, as any of us who have traveled know, it tastes different everywhere around the world, and there's actually a reason for that, and come and hear about it.